Firstly, welcome everybody to this really important discussion. I'm your host, Dr Craig Poku, an atmospheric scientist based at the University of York. I'm really proud to basically say that we're going to be doing this discussion in collaboration with Pride in STEM, and the primary and the main focus is going to be talking about racism within climate change, and more importantly, how marginalised communities are impacted by changes in climate and what we need to be doing going forward. Here I have two people to join me in this discussion. First, we have Salma Sabour, who is a PhD student based at the University of Southampton, and then we have Dan Hdidouan, based at Imperial College London. So, Salma, could you just give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself and just introduce yourself to the audience, please?
So my name's Salma, and I'm a queer postgraduate at the University of Southampton. I'm half Moroccan, half Belgian, and I grew up in Morocco for the first 16 years of my life. So I had an engineering diploma from École Centrale Paris in France and the University of Liège in Belgium in 2013. And I'm really passionate about adaptation and resilience to climate change, and these subjects are at the center of my career path. And I'm really interested in exploring dynamics between relationships. Dynamics and relationship between communities, community-based approaches, management decisions, and how they can support national, local, regional, and international policies in relation to adaptation to climate change. I worked in coastal management in Morocco and Nigeria before starting my PhD. And now my PhD is about how shoreline change, erosion, sea level rise, and flooding are affecting coastal natural World Heritage sites. And more specifically, there is part of my PhD where I'm looking at how is it affecting indigenous communities in Mauritania. I'm also the Equity and Diversity Inclusion PGR Officer of the Faculty of Engineering and Physical Sciences. And I'm really passionate about political action. Like, I'm an activist. I think it's important to know about stories about post-colonial societies, women empowerment, queer, LGBTQ movements, fight against corrupted governments. And I think we need a big fight towards climate change resilience in the future. And in my free time, I like growing plants, protesting, being lost in forests, dipping in cold waters, and I play music. I have like a brass band in Southampton. So I love people and I love nature, and I love in general.
Excellent. And Dan, I now am going to bring the exact same question to you. So could you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
How can I follow Salma? That was incredible. Well, my name is Dan Hdidouan. I am a South Londoner, born and bred in inner London, across the River Thames. I am half Moroccan, half Italian, so I'm probably the other half that Salma isn't. And I grew up in London on a council estate. I ended up specializing in geography from a young age. I loved the environment and I loved understanding what made us different but the same at the same time. Growing up, it was, I experienced a lot of, I saw and was exposed to different types of discrimination and racism, and I didn't understand that because I grew up in a multi kind of cultural family. So that drive to understand what makes us us kind of led me to trying to appreciate the rockscape and geography a bit more in our environment, because that fundamentally kind of made us different. And I'm also a gay man, so I'm part of the Rainbow LGBTQIA plus community, and I'm proud of that. I am on the end of a PhD at Imperial College London, where I specialise with my research focusing on how climate change impacts renewable power, particularly the resources and the economics of it in the long term, i.e. does the solar radiance change in the future, does the wind resource change in the future, and how might that impact the cost of those energies. And I am now going into a job with a renewable power supplier, so that's quite exciting. I get to work and apply my PhD in different ways, which is always a boon after the trauma that is a PhD. And things about me, I wish I had the incredibleness of Salma here. I like to grow things. Every year I go to Italy and spend some time with family, and I learn how to be a farmer. So I'm really in touch with my roots in many ways. And I think that's it for me. Yeah.
Thank you. Firstly, those are both excellent introductions. And Dan, it's nice to know that I'm not the only South Londoner on this call, which is quite interesting because I've now concluded that us South Londoners need to stick together when it comes to like climate. And I think, Salma, like what I really found quite fascinating about the work that you do is the fact that you speak about like the community engagement, but not only that as well, but you also talk about some of the major challenges surrounding getting particular communities involved with climate research. So to begin this discussion, could you expand on this point for us?
Yes, so just to give like a really simple example of my own experience in trying to conduct research in Mauritania. It's really difficult to conduct research in some areas around the world, and sometimes most of the research are made in really paradisiac places around the world, and there's this or like safe, and in some places where you have social or political environments that doesn't feel safe, like countries or in war, or countries that are deemed dangerous for foreigners. For example, if you look at the FCO website, so the Foreign and Common Office, advice against all travel and all but essential travel in different parts of Mauritania. So just to start to just start the process to do research there, I had to go through risk assessment to really find reasons why I want to do it there and not in other places that were easier to access, easier to conduct research in. And I find the experience a bit sad personally, because I was willing to do everything to go there, and there were not specific reason. It was just I'm really passionate about desertic areas, and it is a desertic area with a local community that nearly no one knows about, you know. And I feel the fact that that research are not and collaborative research, and also funding, because if I decide to have collaborator there and work with them, then the funding I've got in the UK is supporting research there, yeah. And and I think those voices of those communities and those like the research that can happen in all these places that are not deemed safe for research creates an imbalance in our understanding of the world, you know. And the research protocol as well, like the research protocol is really westernized. Like if you go in Africa, there's a lot of people doing research, but they never publish papers because it's really complex. You need a lot of money, you need it's a really harsh system. It's not easy when to do that. So they have just a lot of reports, and there's also research done in indigenous ways, because most of the research protocol follow some techniques that are coming from the west. They're not. There's other ways of conducting research elsewhere that we don't even know about, because there is this predominance of the white way of making research. And I think we need to open ourselves to first saying, okay, I'm a researcher and I'm taking risk, and I want to take risk to go do research in this country. It's my responsibility. Can I have this responsibility? And also accepting that maybe there are other ways of doing research. There might be indigenous approaches of conducting research that we don't know about, because we just know this specific system. And of course, there is it's in the UK. You can start seeing that like lots of nature journal are starting to like acknowledge that you need to have more minorities groups supported in doing research. You know, if you look at like just papers in general, like most of the writers are men, white. You know, it's really striking, and it's really sad. And then it brings just one point is. Research can be creative. Research is like anything else. It can be creative. We can be creative in it. We don't need to always follow the same methodologies. We can be more creative. Like we can bring creativity in research as well, and have it like less structured in one specific way, because we're missing a lot of info. Like we're missing a lot by doing it always maybe in the same way. At least this is my personal opinion.
I think that's a really interesting point that you make there, because what you're basically highlighting is that in order for minority communities to be able to engage in research, they basically need to conform to the norm. And I say this norm in the sense that it's a very white Eurocentric way of basically the way that we kind of conduct research. And what's really interesting over the last, say, year or so is the fact that we're finding that there are a lot of groups who are like, we need to engage in the BME community, we need the BME community to engage. But what they're really trying to say is that actually they're going, you need to engage in the way that we do stuff, and hence then you're basically conforming to the academy. So the question I'm going to actually follow up with that, and you talk about Indigenous communities, is how do you think that the research that these communities do would be critical in order for us to actually understand how to address future climate problems?
I think that it's critical because we need to incorporate different visions of the world. For instance, if you look at how indigenous communities are much more resilient to climate change than Western communities, because they are much more connected to nature and they've been adapting to changes from a long time. There's the possibility that we need diverse views. Like, even personally, from me, just being bisexual and coming from different, like from growing in a different countries, doing my PhD in the UK, it opens my mind also to the differences on how people perceive climate change. For example, if you look at in Bangladesh, most of the people, like, there've been this assessment where lots of people living in South Bangladesh were going up north because of lots of flooding happening in the south, which is one of the biggest mangrove forests in the world. However, when they asked people, why were you going to the north, to the cities, they were, okay, we have issues, we can't find jobs, we are not resilient anymore, we need work, we have health problems, we need to have access to healthcare. Climate change have never been perceived as the problem. And I think, and this is really interesting, because when you look at it, you're like, oh, actually they're moving because there's more and more flooding and there is no, but there's so much things. There's like this social justice linked to climate change that is even more important than climate change, is how climate change is affecting minorities and communities that are more vulnerable than others. And for instance, in the UK, we don't feel the effects of climate change. We don't relate to the effects of climate change. Like, we have maybe some storms, a little bit more storm, like this April, but even we don't relate. And it's, people are living so far away from us and from our understanding on what's climate change, that's actually relating to what does it mean climate change is affecting people's community. It's really difficult when you never experienced it. So this is why we need people who are experiencing it to tell their stories and to be empowered to do their research, because research within their countries, you know, and their finding to be shared and to be acknowledged, because they are having a complete different experience from what we have. And we are like, at least like for example in the UK, we have like amazing research about climate change, sea level rise and everything, and we're trying to understand the impacts and everything, but it's coming from our point of view, and we need to remember that this is our point of view. It's my point, it's like there is an individual point of view that is linked to my story, and if we don't look at other communities' stories and bringing them not just like in books and everything, but bringing them into the research community, I think we're missing the real impacts of climate change in communities, and we're missing how to deal with it and how to adapt to it in general, because we don't have the experience to relate to and to understand how it is affecting people's life.
I think that's a really interesting point, in the sense that the way in which climate change within the West is sort of portrayed is that, oh, well, it's happening right now. And it is happening right now, because if you look at, say, so I'm half Ghanaian, half Jamaican, and in Ghana, for example, people who live there are already seeing the impact of climate as it is. But one thing that is really interesting to think about is the fact that it's very difficult for you to empathize with a situation or a circumstance unless you're going through it yourself. And I think that because a lot of people aren't seeing those changes, it's very difficult. One thing to also note as well, and I think this is very important, is the fact that you can't just see climate as an individual situation, in the sense that it's so entangled with so many different social justices. And I think the way that somebody said it was, you can't talk about climate justice without talking about racism, which is something we're going to be discussing later in this discussion. But I guess what we're going to do now is, one thing to note about this is that the way that we kind of think about climate is through colonialism. And Dan, so going to you, your climate research is unique in the sense that you've not only acknowledged, but that you acknowledge and also account for colonial legacies in your work. So why do you think this is critical when it comes to addressing the climate crisis?
Thanks, Craig. I'd like to, if I can be really cheeky, I'd like to amplify and build off of what Salma just mentioned, and yourself too, Craig, with the fact that when climate change it's not just, it's a double-edged sword with like traditional ecological or environmental knowledge. It's not just the resilience in these communities that's valuable, but it's also the fact that there are even more vulnerable people in these communities, particularly in the queer and trans space. And if climate change exacerbates social justices, our queer peers, our people of the LGBT community in this area also have to relive a trauma associated with reestablishing themselves and finding a new sense of belonging in a world where everyone's fighting for themselves, because there's so much like uncertainty around shelter, food, warmth, water, and access to healthcare. And that can be incredibly hard if you are going through a change yourself or a transition, especially like our trans siblings do. And that is why it's important for us in these kind of discussions to represent and increase and improve those visibility, because lack of empathy, there are things that we will never be able to understand as who we are, but we have the ability to at least listen and then process and hopefully act with people included in the decision making. And I think that will be a theme that we probably touch upon quite often in this chat. But back to my kind of area, I would say there is increasing acknowledgement in the scientific community of just the inability to sometimes just do your work, to do your job properly. And that's because of data issues. That's because of the understanding that we have is assumed to be ubiquitous around the world, but in reality it's based off of just generations and institutional capacity that isn't available elsewhere. It can often lead to an overrepresentation of our methods, of our research on the global scale. And that's kind of reflected in the fact that, as was mentioned just earlier, that, you know, by Salma, that certain academics around global south institutions, to use the term, often probably don't publish in the same way that Europeans and North Americans do. And that is a big gap. It's a big gap for everyone, because in science we try and objectively understand our world. And the histories of living in a system and being conditioned in this system where you work hard and then you publish and then you share findings and you collaborate in areas where that might not be the precedent, it is hard for the academia, as you said, Craig, to kind of collaborate and to work with them. It's a two-way street, and I think there is just quite a lot of misunderstanding around how do you collaborate between different cultures. I mean, if we have racial and cultural issues here in the UK, and we're quite a developed economy, and we like to think we're a developed society, imagine what it's like doing that transboundary. Imagine what it's like doing that with people from around the world with different belief systems, different social systems, and different educational systems. When it comes to the colonial legacies, studying at Imperial College London and having previously been at UCL, these world-leading institutions have at some point in their past been involved with, less than stellar dealings. And the capabilities and the skill sets that have been developed were sometimes maybe potentially used to inform and extract resources. And at the time when that was happening, it was acceptable and it was fine. But to leave the history in the history and the statues up where the statues are, we need to critically reevaluate our perspectives and say, could we be doing more based on our past? Is our current standing fair? How can we revisit the idea of equity in how we teach, in how we research, how we collaborate? Is it fair that funding, lots of funding, like Salma was saying, is brought to the table and then it's limited in where it can be spent because of these very archaic notions of what is safe and what is a good community or what is a good culture? And I think we need to be having more of these discussions. There are no right or wrong answers, but there are ways in which we can progress it, because I feel we are not the solution. The three of us today aren't going to solve racial or homophobic issues or gender issues or ability issues in STEM. No. But what we can do is improve the platform for others to fight with us and to continue that kind of progression. So that's my research itself kind of tries to do that in the climate change and renewable energy sphere by trying to lean more on global data sets, which can be improved by global technology rather than focusing on continental and regional areas, because we know a lot about wind and solar in Europe. We know a lot about wind and solar in North America. We know not much about it in sub-Saharan Africa, you know, and that's because there's a lack of historical record there. And that could be improved with new technology and just collaborating and listening to the people on the ground. And at the moment, people don't have those skills to really effectively do that. And that's where perhaps, you know, we as intersectional people, we as a diverse community can begin to leverage our skills to really help and, you know, really accelerate this kind of development and low carbon transition globally, in my opinion.
I think, so to touch upon a point that you said with regards to the way how, and actually this was also, funnily enough, building up on Salma's point, about the way in which we sort of conduct research. So recently there have been, in the UK government, there's been major cuts to research that primarily focuses on working with countries outside of the UK or what's classified as the Global South. And what's really interesting is the fact that there are a number of projects of this nature where they will be saying we're going to be doing collaboration between, say, the UK and, say, Ghana to look at forecasting, as an example. But what you find is that there is a power dynamic within that, because a lot of these projects, rather than giving equitable finances to both parties, you find that the finance will only be on one side and not the other. And the reality is that the way in which capitalism works, it then means that you're then finding that one side has all the power and they can call all the shots, meaning that it's not a fair knowledge exchange. And then that is something that's quite critical. And you could also argue that's basically exploitation in itself. So whilst of course I know a lot of brilliant researchers that have been let go on these projects, I hope that maybe when it comes to them reevaluating it in the future, they can then go, we need to actually do this on a much better scale. And I think that is, it all stems back to colonialism. It all stems back to power dynamics. It all stems back to the fact that the West have always basically played the kind of cards into it. And one of the things that I've been noticing quite a lot in the climate space is this push towards green energy. So for those in the audience who want to know, when we talk about green energy, we're talking about the fact that we want to move towards like renewable energy. But one thing to note is that a lot of renewable energy involves having to gain raw materials, which of course in the UK we don't have. And so one thing that we completely risk, of course, is that if we are having to have this push towards green energy, we're still going to be exploiting these communities who probably need these resources for other things. So I guess for you, Dan, how can it be that if we are going to be pushing towards green energy in, say, the West, and this is, of course, your opinion, how do we carry on doing this without also exploiting these communities, as an example?
Thanks, Craig. I think, and I'd invite Salma as well, because with Mauritania and Morocco, there are parallels with resources, like with phosphates, with groundwater, and with fisheries in particular as well. I know and Salma can really add to that because she's much more closer to the realities there. It's hard to really pinpoint where in a world of imperfections these kinds of problems began to magnify and began to really accelerate. I think as someone, and I don't know how everyone else feels, as someone who I've always had like an interesting internal conflict with who I am, being the fact that I am, born in the UK, but I'm different. I'm not ethnically, typically, conventionally, traditionally, indigenously British,
Yeah.
I'm a man, but I don't fancy women. I've fancied other men, I'm different sexually. And I've always come in from a different angle. And that's a different aspect of the creativity that Salma was talking about before. And you begin to learn, and I've been conditioned, as we all probably have, into a different way of understanding what the normalness is, what the common census of the reality in our world is. And this has gained me insight into understanding what market dynamics is. This was a very long-winded introduction to be like, I know what market dynamics is. I can speak the go on.
No, continue.
I can speak the language of these bankers, and I can understand the system that they've created. But I can also see with my own eyes how it impacts people on the ground, how it impacts my black brothers, sisters, and non-binary siblings, how it impacts women, how it impacts people who aren't physically fully abled. I can see that because of who I am. And it's hard because there are different realities going on here. So you touched upon like capitalism, or let's be even more blunt about it, the quest for profits has been detrimental to everyone on the planet, except for those who have speculated to invest in those profits. I think we can all agree. I think we can understand and accept that these resources, and sadly the exploitation of these resources with this money in this system, has also improved the quality of life for a lot of people. So, and this has also fundamentally been based on industrialization and the seek to maximize those profits as a system to improve quality of life, which is basically colonialism. That's what happened. Sadly, no one wants to really accept it. Our success is built off of the colonies. And if you think it was a two-way street, I would say we really should be revisiting what history has been, how history has been taught. When it comes to the current issues of the green and low carbon transition, undeniably, rare earth metals, other, rarer materials have been extracted from conflict zones for decades. Sadly, this isn't a uniquely renewable energy thing, but it shouldn't be excused. Recently, the EU had brought in legislation saying you can't procure solar panels from communities where there has been exploitation. So I believe this includes China, with the Uyghur population of Muslims there. And we can edit this out because we can quickly double check, so I'm not kind of allegedly saying these legal issues. But that's an example of how you might be able to rectify a market failure. And the market failure is people are sometimes bad people and they exploit people for profit under a market system. And a market failure of that would be to exploit people for the detriment of their quality of life for profit or for export. The Congo is a great example of a colonial just mess, really impacting the quality of life of the local population and really enabling the extraction of unfettered resources. So when it comes to how we move forward, I think we need to continue to ask questions as to where this comes from. Is this transition really what we should prioritize in terms of the lowest source of the lowest cost this, the lowest cost that? That is really just a repeat and a recycle of the system that has led us to where we are. Intensification and industrialization has provided benefits to everyone, especially as someone who's poor, especially people like me who have been on the breadline all my life. But I'm really torn because I see the potential in everyone, and I see the realities of that potential never really being realized. And so I've really exploded a very simple question, Craig, into a can of worms, and it's because there's no real simple answer. I think if we employ good practice, we can reduce the exploitation that we have in the production of renewable and low carbon technologies. We also need to accept that these economies have a right to access existing and contemporary and historic technology. So we can't just enforce them to have solar panels. We can't just force them to pay for wind turbines, especially at our exorbitant cost. If we want them to be part of this sustainable transition, we need to empower them to have these technologies too. The question is, are we going to wait another 200 years before we give them a gun? Or are we going to give them a wind turbine in the next 5 years? And that's the lesson we can really learn from history.
Exactly. And I think that's one... I mean, firstly, that was an excellent answer, because I don't think that you can have a simple answer to it, because it's so deep-rooted, I would say. And so, again, it goes back to the point that we were talking about with Salma, where it's this whole thing of going, okay, so you want to get these communities involved, you want to give them a voice, and then you then basically then say, oh yeah, so we're going to keep still exploiting you, but doing this kind of like performative way of doing stuff. Salma, actually, do you have any additional thoughts to the points that Dan was making? Because given the fact that you work with communities on the ground, I would be very interested to know, like, have you noticed that there has been a shift in the way in which these communities are exploited with the whole push for green energy? Or do you think that we're still in the same predicament, I would say?
First, I really want to say that, like, I really loved your answer, Dan. It was like you have such an amazing way of putting all your ideas together, and you're really clear in everything you're saying, which, like, I struggle with most of the time. I'm just like, which idea, how to bring them together. But just to come back to that, I just want to bring, personally, I think renewable energies are important, but at the same time, I think that our perception to profit and our perception in how we want to carry living in this earth all together needs like a drastic change. Because with all the renewable energies, if we keep living as we are living, with like considering actually with more that we need, we all live with much more that we need. I think it's, and some people even more, billionaires, multi-billionaires, and recognizing that the shift needs to come from our, like, not just our behavior as individual, but our behavior as a culture, as a human culture, as a country culture, as individual culture. It's like the culture of relationship needs a shift. And I want to talk about one. I'm really passionate about permaculture. So it's like a design principle of how to interact with nature, with people. And there's 3 simple principles. It's earth care. So how do you care for the earth? People care. How do you care for people? And fair share. And fair share doesn't exist. There is no fair share anyway in the world we're living. I think it's really simple principles that if we think about them, how can we be fairer in what we are using, how we are exploiting earth, how people are exploited, and not having exploitation anymore, but just like using what we need and giving back, like this giving back. There's this one question, what do we do for the earth? Like in last week, what did me or you or like anyone did to care for the earth? just like if you think about it, like I struggle sometimes. I'm like, yeah, I planted some seeds and everything, but this is also a little bit for me, you know, to eat. What do I do for the earth with no expectation, you know, just giving? What do I give to the earth? What do I give to the people without expectation? And in relation to exploitation, I think especially in the global south, like I know in Morocco, there is a big trauma. It's the whole communities are traumatized, and in countries where it is taboo to talk about lots of subjects, it is really hard. Like I know there is still exploitation in Morocco by Moroccan of Moroccan, you know, and the colonies before have just strengthened the minorities. So for what's happening in Morocco, there were indigenous communities, Amazigh communities, who are like 60% of the communities today. And when the Arab came, they have been the minorities, and the colonizer, most of the time, they come and they privilege the minorities because they are minorities, and they empower them. And then the indigenous communities of the country and the empowerment of those minorities, who are also just like colonizers as well, created some complex dynamic in the country. Like it's so complex, you don't even know who is exploiting who, how the exploitation. And you have, of course, exploitation from Europe, because the richest groups in Morocco are getting richer by giving whatever Europe wants, and getting all the privileges of having this contact with European groups, you know. And in Mauritania, for example, like the fisheries is like it's amazing. Like even, you know, in Mauritania they don't eat fish. Like Mauritanian are nomads who live in the desert. The communities I'm working on are ancient slaves who escape the slavery and went to live in the coast. They're the only communities that are really connected with the coast. But most of Mauritanian communities, they are nomads. So they live in the desert. They eat meat. Fish is not something they eat. So like all the fisheries of Mauritania, it's not for Mauritanian, it goes away. Like all the resources in terms of fish, it doesn't stay in the country. Like you may have some things, you know, but most of the fish is not even culturally in the country to eat fish. So, and you can see how actually exploitation of resources, it's not even sometimes for you. It doesn't, lots of agricultural stuff in Morocco, lots of the best vegetables grown in Morocco, they don't stay in Morocco. They go to other countries, and there is exploitation of resources, but then there is another exploitation by the country because of the trauma that is not solved of their own people. In Morocco, we say always, never trust a Moroccan. Can you imagine? You're in a country and you say to everyone coming, never trust a Moroccan, because it's really, yes. And in Morocco, if you're not Moroccan, if you don't look Moroccan, you will be treated like a king. But if you're Moroccan, you're treated so badly. And these are, I think, it's in lots of traumatized, because these traumas, we don't talk about them. And there has never been an acknowledge, like a kind of, you know, when you ask for forgiveness, but from your heart. I don't think our communities, like in Morocco, or like all colonized communities, have ever received asking for forgiveness from the heart. You know, it's like when you have a problem with someone and you can feel whether they ask for forgiveness from their heart or they ask for forgiveness just to feel good. And you can, and then this trauma is never solved. And it's psychological, it's emotional, it's physical, it's societal. Like this is the results of exploitation and colonialism, and it is so deep, you know. Here you can understand mental health issues. In Morocco, mental health issues are still considered as a shame, you know. You can't go see a therapist, you know. You can, and all this is linked maybe to other things, you know, the facts, to our culture, to how, but also to the trauma of colonies. And I think there's sorry if I'm a bit emotional, but it saddens me, because I don't think there is a real acknowledgement of what's really how colonies have affected people and their livelihood and their understanding of themselves. And yeah, I don't know if Dan want to add something to that, but yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry if I was a bit shaky.
Sorry, I was just going to build off of this, and it's Salma. It was a really beautiful explanation, and this is where I can kind of help elucidate or add to this, to the feeling of this conflict in our communities, and I mean collectively as those who have ever been a different, those who have ever been an other. And my dad is Amazigh, and he couldn't read or write, and he was like sold off when he was young to herd goats and support his family, who eventually went to school, his siblings, but not him. And so he came over to the UK like in the 70s. And so I'm a first generation immigrant, and I ended up, I'm finishing a PhD at Imperial College London. I've used a supercomputer. My dad couldn't read or write. This is an example of the conflict we face in who we are as the children of immigrants, the children of multicultural households, queer people. Women, we are a rebellion in ourselves. You know, and this is why the issue of colonialism and capitalism and market solutions to these problems is really diverse, because on the one hand, it has been really exploitative, and on the other hand, it's enabled us to be who we are in a weird way. And I think this ambiguity and uncertainty about our shared identity of belonging is really just allowing that trauma that Salma was describing. And that trauma manifests itself in different ways in different communities with different identity markers, and everyone has this kind of weird conflict internally. And ours is so visible in who we are because we've been told for generations, if not we are the first of a kind of a generation, where we are really being like, no, you can be you. Like, colonialism was terrible and it enabled me to be who I am because of, you know, I definitely wouldn't have been alive if Morocco wasn't colonized by France and my dad didn't use his network to be able to, you know, emigrate. But at the same time, we need to be very truthful and very reflective of the real experiences and say, hold on a second. I know you guys haven't seen what's gone on, and I know you guys have been shown a reality and a history that isn't actually reflective of what's been experienced elsewhere. But let me show you with an open mind and an open heart, and let's go and see it, and let's see what we can do about it. It's not going to be quick, but let's try and improve the situation for everyone. And that's not what we're having. We're having a situation where he said, she said, you know, they're attacking me, I'm being defensive, so I'm attacking them. And we'll get onto this because I know, Craig, this has so many parallels with Black Lives Matter as well. And the whole debate around, you know, is this trauma preventing me from accepting myself? Is this trauma affecting others, you know, accepting who they are and who I, you know what I mean? It's so multi-layered. And, but yeah, I'd be keen to hear your thoughts too.
So I think I'm going to build up on what both of you said, actually. I think that you notice this quite a lot whenever it comes to discussing minority communities within the UK, where an issue will arise, and what you'll find is that you then get what I like to call whataboutism. So it's this idea of, but what about like the white working class, or what about this, what about that? And what's something that I guess kind of hit a raw nerve was this idea within the Black community and different parts of the diaspora, where you'll find that some Black people will feel that they're better than other Black people. And so they then have this aspect of kind of going, well, you had this oppression, but I was even more oppressed. And so therefore you end up having this kind of in-level fighting. And I think that when I hear other white people very bluntly discuss this, my argument is, but you don't know, or you can't really make a valid point to this argument because you're not acknowledging your privilege or you're not acknowledging your part in colonialism. And I think the reason as to why all of this is very important when it comes to like the way how we address climate is because it's so multifaceted. And the way in which we address research, the way that we kind of address activism, the way that we sort of address all of these points, you need to not only acknowledge colonialism, but you need to also acknowledge the intersectionalities within that. So, what do we mean by intersectionalities? We all, everybody in the world has different characteristics, and some characteristics are more oppressed than others. So, as an example, if you are a cis male compared to a cis female, you will find that a cis male will have it easier in life. Like, whether that means that they don't have to deal with the gender pay gap, or whether it is more the fact that they are going to not have their integrity questioned. If you are queer versus being straight, then of course then there are other oppressions within that as well. So as an example, as a black queer male myself, I know that society will penalize me because I'm both black and queer, but because I'm a cis male, I then know that I can sort of control a room that I know that if I was a black woman, I would not be able to have. But I say that intersectionality is really important to acknowledge is because with that different viewpoint, I can now basically address the work that I do from a different perspective. And so a question to both Salma and Dan, so to both of you, why do you think it is critical to incorporate race as well as gender and sexual identity in the way that we address future climate? Because we're fully aware that as queer people, it's not just even the case that climate is happening, it's the fact that climate, as you said, Dan, is making the trauma of being queer within a space that you can't be yourself even more apparent. But why is that critical to incorporate in the way that we do any future climate work? So, Salma, do you want to begin?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for summarizing everything so nicely. I think I'm just gonna listen to this discussion again and again, just have it on my just try and listen to it. It's really nice to be able to share, you know. I think first, like, if you look at indigenous communities, for example, their resilience to climate change, but also their vulnerability to climate change is more and more recognized by the scientific and the policy literature. And if you look at indigenous communities, their life is based on a reciprocal relationship with animals, plants, and ecosystems. And within that, you can see that responsibilities associated with this relationship are gendered in many indigenous communities. So from the beginning, gender is important for doing any research, because at least for indigenous communities. And in terms of intersectionality, I think we need to understand how different individuals and group relates differently to climate change. And as you were saying, because each group actually have more acceptance or less acceptance depending on where. Like, for example, perception of climate change of queer communities in Morocco. Who knows, you know? Who knows about this? Because queer communities in Morocco are not allowed to express themselves, are not allowed to exist. They're imprisoned. They need to go find refuge in other countries. So this question cannot even be answered because they can't exist in a country. So, but this cannot be changed right now. But it's just to show you that by not accounting for race, gender, and sexual identity, we don't have a holistic view on any subject, because everyone's experiencing things differently, especially on groups that are minorities and that are stigmatized by societies, or in general by the human concept of what is being human. And I think also it's important to look at power structures, because when you do research by accounting of sexual orientation, identity, gender, you're actually also assessing different power structures, and you can see what is affecting that. How this being like a cis male, how your perception being a cis male changes from queer, and how these different perceptions, where do they converge and where do they diverge. And then understanding how different social categorizations change, like the perception of different social categorizations have different views on climate change. And I think intersectionality is the only way to enable solidarity and beyond social categories, and try and really to look at okay, what's people think, what's this human, this thing that make us all the same, our human, us being human. How do we relate to climate change as human and not as, different categories? And actually, to be able to have the human side, the holistic side, we need to explore all categories. It looks like, it's like a little bit contradictory, because actually, to be able to have the holistic view, we need to look at different categories. And for me also as a researcher, intersectionality is the best way to do critical thinking. It's the best way to kind of approach the same problem with different views, and not just methodological approaches, but different views of people. And thank you.
Yeah, no, I think that's the really key point here, and about the fact that intersectionality does need to be taken into account whenever we're doing this type of research. But what's also so there was something that you said about, like, for example, queer people in Morocco and their sort of like how climate's going to impact them. But then afterwards, then it then ties into like the whole kind of prison system, which you find will penalize marginalized communities, not only just in, say, places like Morocco, but across the entire world, as we've seen. And so then that then kind of goes, well, when we talk about, like, climate impacts, we always seem to only focus on people that have the freedom to be able to do what they want and be able to kind of live the lives that they are. We never, ever, ever get the viewpoints of those who are basically being reprimanded, or not reprimanded, but are basically being penalized by the system. Dan, I would love to hear your points on this, because you've kind of brought up on some of these in the discussion that we've had so far.
Yeah, thanks. This has been really great to hear. And also, it's nice to hear that it's not just going on in my head, which I've been told is what usually happens in this world. But I would say, to build off of what Salma said, where she would just really nicely describe that conflict between what is the kind of the conception of what is fair and what should be happening, what is my internal truth and from my professional experience, and what is actually perceived to be happening from outside of me. What is that common census? What is going on? What do everyone else believe? Or what are we conditioned to kind of expect to believe? And that conflict is actually what I believe furthers knowledge. That is, we face it as, and it's easy to forget, as we are here discussing things being different, different, having identities which are diverse, which are intersectional. We are in this chat, in this discussion, having this conversation, but we are also, another commonality we have is that STEM, is that climate change background. And that conflict that we're experiencing with our own personal identity and the knowledge that we are learning and the knowledge we are creating, that is what really is pushing the boundaries of thought and of understanding. And so when you do have that conflict, do not shy away, which we have been taught to do, because that is contravening the idea of what power is, of what truth and reality is. That is us pushing through these barriers. So that conflict, although it's frustrating and although it's really can be traumatizing, that is the value we are providing to this world. And if we can break through that boundary, or at least push it, or at least try and rationalize it, someone else can come along after us and add to it. And that is basically what the academy should be,
Yes. But the reality is that the academy isn't that. And I know that having completed my PhD recently, there were points where I wanted to be very outspoken about things because I would be like, this is sort of this is conflicting with my own personal identity. But then I was also of the opinion where I was like, at this point, without that PhD, without that doctorate, I don't have that power. And it's horrible to think about it, but in the end, the moment I started to become more vocal was the moment I knew that I was guaranteed to get my PhD, and that was when I passed my PhD Viva. And after that, that's when I then became a lot more outspoken in the way in which things are done. And so I commend people who, I sometimes wonder if I held myself back at points because I wish that I had the courage to be able to go, no, that's not right. And so I really commend people who are like, even if it risks me not getting the qualification or me getting the job promotion, that they are still being vocal about these things. And also, one thing to note as well is that there's some really excellent points that have been made here. And one organisation I actually want to bring up is the Racial Justice Network. So I've been working with them for the last few months as a volunteer, which I absolutely adore. And within the organisation, they've formulated what's known as the 13th recommendation for Leeds City Council to address the climate emergency. And the 13th recommendation essentially summarises 3 points. So the first one is that we need to have a more international approach, which are some of the points that we discussed on today. The second one is that we need to acknowledge colonial legacies. So this is not only just within the UK, but also within countries that have been previously colonised and the way in which they sort of deal with their infrastructures. And then the third one is to show solidarity, which I think goes back to what Salma was talking about. This idea of just forgiveness, and not only that as well, but also acknowledging the fact that there is a lot of like internalized trauma. But the reason I talk about the Racial Justice Network is because they're an example of an organization, an activist organization that I would say are doing it right, because they are going, yes, okay, race theory is the focus of what we do, but we're doing the groundwork to actually bring up these discussions and not only talk about climate, but also talk about race in the police and race in society. Other organisations, on the other hand, like Extinction Rebellion, have been critically not critically criticised. They have been criticised on several occasions for not only having no acknowledgement of intersectionality, but also doing things that are quite dangerous. So going to Brixton Police Station and giving them flowers, also not realising that Brixton has got a very high rate of stop and search, which primarily attacks black men. Salma, when we were preparing this discussion, you actually discussed that you do activism within XR, but you say that your subsection of XR is better. Could you go into a little bit more detail and actually see what XR as an organisation can learn from the subgroup that you work with?
Yeah, I think there is like XR have been learning a lot from the experience they've been through. And personally, I don't have a really good relationship with the police growing up in Morocco, and having had have been abused by police power in Morocco. Clearly, it's not something I never feel comfortable with the police. And I remember I went to October Rebellion and I was there, and wherever a policeman was just approaching me, I would like be shaking, you know. And I was not prepared for that as from where I was coming from. And XR have acknowledged this. They acknowledged this mistake, and there have been actually lots of discussions in having a fourth demand. So instead of having the 3 demand of XR, having a 4th demand mainly in relation to social justice. And also what we've done as a group, local group, is that in our 3 demands, in each demand, social justice is included. So we had, the thing with XR is that you have the national group, but you have also the like smaller group, local groups. And in the local group, you can actually, this is where you can actually bring discussions about all these issues, and then you can bring the information to the national group. There's also now the XR Internationalist Solidarity Network that has been formed in 2019, and that is it's mainly led by Black XR members, and it's also so being in contact with XR groups in Africa, in India, in Asia, in South America, and I think there has been issues in the beginning, as you were saying, not acknowledging that, actually saying to people, oh, just go and be like, I consider myself as non-arrestable. I can't be arrested. So I was there, and I was considered, like, I knew that there is always a chance to be arrested, but I was avoiding anything, like, you know, I was not blocking streets. I was like maybe supporting friends. However, I felt that in the beginning there were less trainings about like being aware of that, but XR have really learned from that, from the criticism, and at least in our local group, I feel that it's acknowledged. Like one of our members is really active in that, and really talking, like we spend like months and months talking about that after October, the rebellion in October, and acknowledging what didn't work, what worked, and how did we feel about it. The thing also is that it's true that you have a choice. You can say, okay, I want to go protest or not. But it's not really, you don't always have a choice. Like I feel like I need to be in the streets because I need to be there because it's important for me. It's like, even I don't have a choice, but like at the same time, I need to be aware of any danger or my state, emotional state, and be aware of what the situation can bring me from my past traumas, so I think it's not always like when you say, oh, you can protest, you don't need to protest if you want. I think it's our right to protest, and doing it like in different ways. And I feel personally that XR have made lots of work in including intersectionality, at least in my local group. I feel like in all our 3 demands, so we changed the demands, so our demands are different from XR, so they are still the same information, but we added to them. So for instance, we have our 3rd demand. It's the XR demand is people assembly, and our demand is trust the people. And its governments must upgrade democracy by creating a citizen assembly on climate and ecological justice to decide the changes needed, and thereby enable the transition to a regenerative and redistributive economy that prioritizes the rights of the most vulnerable communities. And we this is what I like about XR is the freedom. It's not hierarchical. So there are you're not obliged to do national action if you don't want. You can, and I'm personally really active in local actions because I feel this is where I can do the most. And yeah, I think they're making progress. They acknowledge their mistakes. I think when someone's telling you, I acknowledge a mistake and I'm trying to improve, it's a good sign, you know. And they're not doing it because all the people want the similar things. So yeah. Thank you.
No worries. I think for me, so I have a very conflicting relation with XR, and I think that this has primarily been because I've worked with organisations called the Racial Justice Network, and I've sort of seen the kind of groundwork that they can do. I do think that local action definitely has its benefits because you've got a little bit more control with how you can sort of do stuff. I think that one thing to note, though, is that even if it's the case that you acknowledge that you're making a mistake, it's going to take a very long time for you to sort of unlearn that behavior, and not only unlearn it, but then actually then start doing the right things. So I say this is somebody who, growing up in South London, as an example, I was surrounded by quite a lot of homophobic and transphobic language, and the language around women was very misogynistic. And I would even say comments like this, which I now find like, teenage Craig, what were you doing? Where I'd be like, I can't be around gay men, but lesbians are okay, which is so problematic in itself. And that's literally stemmed from the fact that within these spaces, that language was okay. I'm still working on that myself. And so whenever I see people go, we've acknowledged a mistake, we're now including this, we're now including that, I'm like, it's not as simple as just going, oh, now we're starting to do this. And this brings us quite nicely to the end of the discussion. So, just to say, firstly, I've really enjoyed being able to host this, and I hope that the audience have really enjoyed it too, because one thing that we're hoping as a sort of takeaway message is that you kind of need to get marginalized communities involved in the climate conversation and not just do it as a sort of performative action. Um, as we're all aware, one thing to note is that it's now been a year since the murder of George Floyd in the States, which obviously triggered the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement across the world. And whilst we're aware that the police officers that killed him have now been sentenced, whilst for some people they claim it's justice, I would argue it's accountability, because even after George Floyd got killed, black people are still being killed around the world. Brown people are still being killed around the world. People within marginalized communities, in vulnerable communities, are still being killed around the world because of who they are. And one thing to note after the Black Lives Matter movement, and I know what my answer to this, but I'm interested to hear your viewpoint, was the fact that we saw a lot of organizations across the entire spectrum claim we're supporting Black lives, we are here for the Black Lives Matter, and a lot of these organizations fall within the climate movement. So I guess as a summary from both of you, a final summary, do you think that there has been progress in terms of what organizations are doing to support Black lives and more broadly marginalized communities? And if so, and if they're not doing that, what bit of advice would you give to organizations to actually make them do accountable change? So, Dan, would you like to begin this?
Yeah, thanks. It was really interesting, both of your points on how we protest and how we can manifest and project our own kind of real and legitimate concerns and kind of critique the society around us to be a bit more open-minded and to be a bit more progressive. For me, I would say the fact that we are here today having this conversation is the biggest progress I've seen in my lifetime. I grew up kind of very similar to what you were saying, Craig, and with the inherited and my own traumas from my family, which Salma was describing. I didn't have anything like this growing up, and it's beautiful to see that at least 3 of us can come together and speak so openly about our experience, and that is the way forward. We need to be more honest and open about our lives so other people can see we're not so different. In terms of the way forward, I'm keen to the real question that we have to continue discussing is the progress we're making for inclusion, for equity, for diversity, for intersectionality in the world, in STEM and in justice, is it going at the right pace? And are we satisfied? Do we accelerate it, or do we continue trying to make sure no one is left behind? That, for me, is what we should be focusing on, because the discussion we just had between XR and Black Lives Matter and all of these diverse and beautiful ways of expressing rebellion, the goal is the same. I think the means are different, and we should come together as a community and touch stone and just basically be like, what you're doing is a bit extreme. Not to deny anyone's right to be who they are, because that would be fundamentally against what we represent, but to do it in a way that's, considerate, and do it in a way that's enfranchising and inclusive. And that for me is the take home. How do we continue with this discussion in an amicable, respectable, and one in a way which has integrity and robustness, so the people who come after us can continue the work that we've done and the people before us did, and applaud them and celebrate and move on. So that's how I'd summarize. There's a lot of incredible and beautiful work going on. How can we continue it?
I think that's really important to ensure that nobody is left behind, because it's this idea that we are all one with the planet. We should all be giving back to the planet. And I think that you're still finding that even when people claim that they're still trying to ensure that marginalized communities are involved, that they're doing it in a very exploitative and still in a very power dynamic way. So it's going, we're giving you a voice, but you're going to try and fit on our table, but actually we've only got one seat and there are 10 of you, as opposed to what should happen is going, no, actually we've decided we're going to make our own table instead, and we're going to do this discussion, and we are knowing that we're going to have really valid points, and that's the main thing here. Salma, how about you? Do you have a final summary for whether or not the climate movement has been better at incorporating racial justice? And if not, what one bit of advice would you give these organizations?
For me, I think as I feel the same than what Dan says. I think there is progress, but at the same time, is this progress going fast enough? Because we don't have much time in terms of responding to climate change. Because if you look at really what's happening, it's like nothing of what's really needed is happening. And the same for inclusion. How long do we need? Like you were saying, that we need time to really unlearn, but is there any way to unlearn? I know there's like always need of time, but how can we unlearn things in a most efficient way? Because I think there is a problem of time, and we can't just take all of the time to include everyone. We need to include everyone right now. We need to hear all the voices right now. We need to think about the planet, about the future generations right now. Like there is this urgency, and I think this is why the situation is really complex, is that there is urgency, we don't have time, and all what we need to do needs time. So this is why I think one of the notion I really love is cultural emergence. Is instead of trying to change things, just emerging with something new, just like transforming and creating something new together. And instead of unlearning, just learning what we need to learn, because the unlearning process will take time. But what do we need to learn now to be able to do something, and because it's two processes that are different and they're both needed. But can we take action and then continue our healing? You know what I mean? It's like we need actions, and we need as a human being, as a community of human being living on a planet that is out of breath, and we are out of breath. Like we can feel it. Everything we're doing to the planet reflects on us. We are so yeah, for me there is progress, but I think there is also a need of something new to emerge from all of us as a community in solidarity, because we don't have time. And I think the question of time is really complex, because we don't have time, and we need to create. Fast changes are not good. This is why I was saying, like, not fast changing, but emerging. I like this idea of emerging, because it's just like it's not forgetting about what happened. No, it's considering what happened, but let's just create something right now to just give us also time to be able to unlearn and to heal.
No, I think that is a really nicely put way of saying it, in the sense that it's going, we need to act now, but we also need time to do that unlearning. And I think that in a way it's probably going to be that we're going to be taking action on the unlearning while still unlearning at the same time. So we're going to have to do it simultaneously. And I think that I've really enjoyed hosting this discussion, because it's something that I think that we are making progress. So a year ago, I don't think that people would even be willing to have this kind of conversation. And now we're at a point where, rather than it turning into, oh, we're having a conversation on X, Y, and Z, what we're now saying is we're going, actually, here are some of the actions that some of these groups are doing, and it's in the case of them going, okay, are we actually going quick enough? So I've really enjoyed being able to see that, and that actually now concludes this discussion. So firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to both Salma and Dan for taking time out of their day to be able to do this, because I think that this is something that's quite important. Before I end this, if the audience wanted to find you, where can they find you?
I'm on Instagram and Twitter at Daniel Hdidouan, so all my name, one word, and on LinkedIn especially. If you want to reach out, don't be afraid to write a personal message, and we can continue the conversation there.
The same. I'm on Twitter, Instagram. I will put like information about it in the description, and also on LinkedIn. And I'm also happy to receive any personal message. Sorry if I'm not responding quickly in advance, because it's always so many things happening. But yeah, you're always welcome to contact me and interact with me. I'm always happy to interact.
Awesome. So just for the audience that are watching this, we will leave the details in the description, so you will be able to contact our wonderful panel for further discussion, which I honestly feel like you should. I can also be found on Twitter at C_Poku93. That is basically where I mostly reside. So with that in mind, I'm going to say thank you both for discussing. Again, to our audience, thank you for tuning in. And again, to Pride in STEM, thank you for allowing us to have the space to be able to have this really important discussion. I'm your host, Dr. Craig Poku, and this has been a pleasure. Thank you. Bye.